Let us turn now to the final part of the farmers' movement as we look at what the farmers did when they discovered that the Democrats really were not on the side of the alliance men. All right, so unable to get what they wanted from the Democrats, the farmers again refused to back down. And this time what they did is they decided to form a third party. If the Democrats and Republicans wouldn't listen to them or work with them, then they would form a party of their own. So on July 4th, 1892, the farmers met in Omaha, Nebraska to form a third party known as the Populist Party or the People's Party. And for this party, they held the Omaha Convention. And they planned on running a candidate in the presidential election of 1892. And here's the site of the Omaha Convention. The building on the left is the Omaha Coliseum, where the Populist Party met to organize. And as you can see, it's kind of rural. It's kind of out there in the country. And that's kind of what people thought about this Omaha Convention, that it was kind of rural, kind of out there in the country. Some reporters kind of laughed at people rolling in wagons and wearing overalls, saying that this would be a political party. But the farmers really didn't care at this point what the country thought of them. They were here to make change. We're looking now at the interior of the Omaha Coliseum, and from this place, the Populist Party put together what they called the Omaha Platform, which would be the platform on which they would run for the election of 1892. Now, the Omaha Platform strongly resembled the Ocala demands. It asked for things like a graduated income tax, inflation with silver, the sub-treasury, railroad regulation, but it added some things as well to appeal to the working class. It added things like a request for the direct election of senators and for term limits. And the Omaha Platform also demanded the 8-hour workday, some immigration restrictions, bans on the use of thugs in strikes and such. And for their candidate for the election of 1892, the Populists selected a man named James Weaver, who'd been a currency reformer, the man interested in expanding the U.S. currency back in the Gilded Age. Now, in the 1892 election, in part also because the Populists reached out to everyone. They wanted the working man's vote. They also asked for the black vote because they needed the numbers. In the 92 election, they did credibly well for a third party. They got 3 governors and 10 seats in Congress. And again, that's a pretty good showing for a party in its first time out. They didn't expect to win the presidency, but going into the next major election, 1894, then again in 1896, the Populists were gaining momentum, and they thought they had a shot at the 1896 presidential election. Now, the reason they thought they had a shot in 1896 is because something bad had happened to the American economy. And the Populists, as the party that was demanding help for people, demanding that the government do something to help people, like regulate railroads or put in an income tax or increase the currency, as the party that seemed to care, they thought in bad economic times people would vote populist. But the question is, why did the economy turn bad in the 1890s? And it turns out it's partly because of the farmers. So this is where it gets kind of weird. What we find out is as the farmers grew in power in the 1880s, as the alliance movement grew, they were able to influence the national government to an extent to pass a few laws that helped people in distress. They got a few crossover Democrats to help them a little bit. Now, one of the issues farmers really wanted was inflation, for the government to add silver coins in addition to gold to the currency. And their argument was that the more money that circulates, the value of money goes down, which means the prices for things like crops go up. People who sell like inflation because it makes prices go up. So the farmers said with inflation, using silver will make more money, and then we'll escape the horrid situation we're in with crop lien and debt. And then they figured, well, wages would eventually catch up as well, and everybody would get richer if we just inflate the economy. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 reflected the demands of the populace and also the demands of mining interests who were producing a lot of silver and wanted to get it into the economy. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act added millions of dollars of silver to the United States currency. Now, the government was now helping people who were suffering, helping them by inflating the currency. But in so doing, it destroyed the national economy. Now, here's the thing about economics. It doesn't always work the way you think it's going to work. Sometimes what looks like a really good idea is actually a really bad idea, but you don't know that until you try it. And that's kind of what happened here. The farmers kind of succeeded with the miners in getting silver into the economy. But when the U.S. added silver, it had effects that went way beyond what farmers anticipated. Prices went up, but the economy shattered in the Depression of 1893, which is the second worst depression in American history. And the Depression was triggered by something known as Gresham's Law, which immediately went into effect the second you put silver into the currency. Gresham's Law holds that when currency is involved, bad money destroys good money, and this is what happened. You see, people want good money. They want the money that they're holding in their hands to be the most valuable money, and gold was always worth more than silver. So, when the Sherman Silver Purchase Act started adding silver to the economy, businesses worried that they'd get stuck with lower value silver. They'd get stuck with this metal, and they knew that in the Gilded Age you couldn't trade silver all over the world. Most industrial countries only traded in gold. So big businesses, banks, even regional businesses started mandating that significant payments like mortgage payments, for example, or major purchases, major investments, these all had to be in gold because, again, they didn't want to get stuck with a bunch of silver that they couldn't use in the world. So that trickled down to average people who then got worried that they might not have enough gold in their hands to pay for their mortgages or their business payments or their investments. So average people started using silver to buy gold in order to hoard that gold. And foreign countries, also worried that the U.S. was no longer going to use gold, began to worry that the U.S. wouldn't have enough gold, so they started redeeming U.S. bonds and securities and taking payments in gold. So gold was draining out of the country, and it was draining out of banks as well to go into the hands of private citizens. Now, what happened next is this. Banks actually started to notice fairly quickly that their reserves of gold were shrinking because everybody was borrowing gold or pulling out gold and putting it under their beds, I guess. So banks started redeeming treasury notes as well to get gold from the U.S. government to use to hand out to the people who were coming in to get gold. And then the U.S. government started running out of gold. And when it did, the banks had to suspend payments. That means they had to stop giving people their money because they had no more gold left to give and they couldn't get any more. Now, bank suspensions, as they were called, weren't new in U.S. history. But in this gold crisis, they hit record highs. In June of 1893, for instance, there were 25 bank suspensions that year, that month alone, more than in an entire year, typically. Now, when banks suspended, when they said we can't pay our money anymore, well, people panicked. People started running to their banks saying, I hope my bank can still give me money. I heard the one next door is suspended, so let me get my money out while I can. So banks started failing all over the country. And when banks failed, stocks failed because there were no investors. People wouldn't invest in the stock market. They didn't want to, part with their money. Plus, banks were investors, and when they ran out of money, they could no longer maintain their investments. So businesses that were heavily involved in investments or required investments to operate, such as railroads, they started to fail, and when they failed, they destroyed the businesses that they supplied. So by the end of 1893, we had record numbers of business failures. Our grid was falling apart, and unemployment hit 20%. And again, this is known as the Panic of 1893 or the Depression of 1893, the second worst depression in American history. So it's interesting that one of the farmers' biggest demands that they thought would help everyone, the demand to inflate the economy with silver, actually destroyed the U.S. economy. So this is kind of what farmers were worried about back when they were first forming alliances and first starting to talk about changing the economy. They worried that they simply didn't know enough. They were concerned that maybe this change is, not something we should try. Maybe we're not educated enough. But the speakers bolstered them, told them they could do it, so they went ahead. Now, this is also why many people who were fairly well trained in economics regarded the farmers' movement as a movement of lunatics, they said. Crazy people. Some people even called them traitors. Now, the question is, did the populace understand what they did back in 1893? Did they know what the demand for silver had done to the economy? No, back then, not really, because it's hard to know exactly what's going on in an economy as it's going on. I mean, we're just now starting to interpret the Great Depression 70 years after the event. So, as this depression destroyed the economy and as prices collapsed even further, the populace really didn't understand the relationship between the silver demands and the collapse of the economy. So what they did is they figured, well, we need to help the people. We need the government to help out people who are suffering. So they demanded even more silver to inflate the depressed economy. And they didn't get it this time. The President of the United States in 1893 was Grover Cleveland, and he was a Democrat and somewhat sympathetic to the silver idea. But his party and the Republican Party were adamant silver was the cause of this catastrophe. Silver had to go. So Cleveland repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893, making him look to the populace like he just didn't care. That's not really the truth, but that's kind of how they saw it. So many people were suffering in this depression. They were suffering so hard. They didn't really understand currency, but they knew what they heard from the farmers, the populist movement, and the speakers. The speakers kept telling them, silver is the solution. Silver in this depression. We need to coin more silver and keep inflating the economy. Inflation kills depression. Sticking to gold was perceived by many as inhuman and cruel, that it was indifferent to the people who were suffering, who needed more money. Again, people really didn't understand the complexities of currency. They just thought silver would help. Silver meant you care. We've got to get more silver into the economy. Now, in the election of 1894, the Democrats found that they lost big in this election. Grover Cleveland was the president when the panic hit, and he went back to the gold standard in 1893, and so he was getting blamed for a lot of suffering. He was getting blamed for mismanaging the economy. So there was a big issue facing the Democrats in the coming 1896 election. Here was the Populist Party saying, if you elect us, we're going to coin silver. We're going to help you. The Republicans were saying, no, we're going to stick with gold, and that's just let this depression ride, and we'll get through it by sticking with gold. So the Democratic Party had a big decision to make. Do we stick with the Republicans and stay with gold, knowing that people are going to suffer if you do, but it might be better for the economy in the long run? Or do we look at the populists who are talking about helping people and coining silver, that even if that's maybe not the best idea economically, it sounds good. It sounds like you actually care. Would it be better to go with them and regain some of the losses that they had in 1894? So the party coming up to 1896 was really torn. What do we do? And in the election of 1896, something extraordinary happened. The populists lost. They lost big. In fact, that was kind of the end of the Populist Party. And why, you might ask? Because something really extraordinary happened in the Democratic Party. The party of Grover Cleveland that had renounced the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, that had turned to gold, the party came out in favor of silver and inflation. They came out in favor of helping the people, of standing on the side of the poor. And in 1896, that is when the Democratic Party took on its modern standard as the party of welfare, as the party of the New Deal, the party of Medicaid and Medicare, the party that helped the poor. It all stems from 1896. Now, how did that happen? I mean, last time we heard about the Democrats, they were concerned, but their president, Grover Cleveland, had come out firmly in favor of gold. He was telling his party, we're going to have gold, and we're going to let this depression fix itself by not flooding the economy with silver. Grover Cleveland was a gold man who thought that the way to get out of the economic crisis was to stick with gold. So why did his party turn? Why did his party turn its back on him? Because of a speech that happened right here where this park stands today. I told you, speech making is very important in this period of history. The speech was given by a young Democrat named William Jennings Bryan, who was a rising star in the Democratic Party and going to be their presidential candidate in 1896. Now, he was young. William Jennings Bryan was only 36 years old in 1896, and he single-handedly converted the Democrats to the side of silver, to the side of saying that they cared about the poor. Now, who is Bryan? Well, he was born in Illinois, but he moved to Nebraska when he was fairly young with his family. And though he was a Democrat, he was living in Nebraska, which is one of the most extreme of all the populous states. So Bryan was a Democrat, but he grew up hearing a lot of farmer talk, a lot of farmer rhetoric. He also grew up seeing a lot of farmers suffering. So he was fairly well influenced by the farmers' movement. Now, here's what he did. Bryan was the star of the Democratic Party. He was kind of like the next generation that was going to come in. And what he was most famous for was this speaking voice, a voice so incredible that there's actually an American opera written about it called The Ballad of Baby Doe. And if you want to know a little bit of personal information, I grew up as a child actress. I did opera when I was a kid, and I actually sang The Ballad of Baby Doe in one of the child parts. And my character was the daughter of a big silver miner in the West, and our whole family in the opera was really, really into William Jennings Bryan. So this opera was kind of written at the time that Bryan was very, very famous and very popular. And my character's mother sang lines to me about how Bryan could speak so well that he could charm the very birds off the trees, and that every animal would even come to listen to him because he just spoke so beautifully. And my little child character, actually, I was directed to get a look of wonder on my face and say, William Jennings Bryan, truly. It was incredible how much hero worship there was for this guy, and it was all because of the voice. Now, they called him the Boy Orator of the Platte. The Platte is the main river in Nebraska. So here he was. He came to Chicago, where the Democratic Convention was in 1896. He told the convention, the convention crew, I guess the directors of the convention, that he wanted to give a speech, and they were like, sure, no problem. He said he wanted the last speech. Before the Democrats wrote their platform, he wanted to give the speech, so they gave it to him. So they said the morning of this speech, he was nervous, he was pacing around, he said he was going to throw up, he was really unhappy, and people who knew him said he's going to do something extraordinary. And he did. he went out and gave one of the most influential speeches in American history, a speech known as the Cross of Gold, which single-handedly, as I said, converted the Democratic Party to the issue of inflation, converted them to being pro-silver. It's not just the silver that's important, though. It's what it stood for. If you were pro-silver, you were coming out and flat out saying, I'm with the poor. I want to help them. I want to end suffering, which is not something the Gilded Age really said a lot. So Bryan is bringing significant change to our country here. Now, what did Bryan say in the Cross of Gold? Well, it's not what he said, it's how he said it mostly. A couple things you can note from this speech. First, it's not very long. I mean, it was only about 45 minutes, and that's important. If you want to make a powerful statement that people will remember, don't drone on for 3 hours and bury it. So he kept it short, but what he mostly did was he just spoke. He was William Jennings Bryan, but here's the basic gist of it. I mean, he got up there and he said, I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity, which is an odd thing to say in the Gilded Age when humanity really wasn't on the table. So right off the bat, he's telling you this is going to be something new. And then he starts taking on arguments in favor of gold, and one by one he starts tearing them down. And at one point he said this, you come and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. So here he's telling you, the populace had this idea of silver, and you think it's crazy, but remember who the populace are. Remember that your cities and your educated people are great, but without the farms, they don't have a leg to stand on. Now, he went on and added some other things. He said, upon which side shall the Democratic Party fight? Upon the side of the idle holders of idle capital, or upon the side of the struggling masses? Which in the Gilded Age, there would have been a simple answer to that question, but he's challenging you now, starting to sound a bit more like a populist or a farmer. Now, he said things like, we've been asking for help. The farmers, he's kind of telling you he's standing with them. We've been asking you for help and we've been scorned. We've entreated you for assistance and you've ignored our entreaties. And he said, there will come a time when the large numbers of farmers will beg no longer, entreat no more. We petition no more. We will flat out defy you. So what he's warning you now is, hey, let this situation keep going with all these people suffering, then you're going to have a huge problem on your hands. There's going to come a moment when they're not going to care about petitions or asking. They're just going to take what they need. And he concluded the speech with this really dramatic statement about how, gold was basically like a crucifixion. He said, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. And it's just how he said it. I mean, when he finished the speech, he threw his arms out to either side, mimicking a cross, and yelled, "Cross of gold!" And that was the last statement in the speech, and I guess the hall was really quiet when he did it. And he looked out there and he thought, what, did I just mess up? Did no one care? And apparently everyone in the room was so moved that they were stunned for a minute when he did it. And then everybody started screaming, including, jaded reporters who'd heard every speech in the world. And they jumped up on stage and they carried him around, and the whole Democratic Party got behind this guy and decided that, yes, we're going to come out for silver, for helping the poor, for siding with the struggling masses. It was a new era in the Democratic Party, thanks to William Jennings Bryan. Now, of course, this left the populace in kind of a dilemma because silver was their big issue. That was the thing they had that neither the Democrats or the Republicans had. The populace stood for the common man and the people suffering in the Depression. So when Bryan took their issue and took it to the Democrats, well, they kind of were not happy about it. They had to make a choice. Do we go with the Democrats who just, stole our best issue, or do we put our own candidate out there and take votes away from Bryan, which guarantees a Republican victory? What do we do? In the end, the populace ended up throwing their support to William Jennings Bryan, who then promptly lost the election. Now, there's a number of reasons why that happened. Some say that Bryan got a little frantic on the campaign trail, trying to recreate the magic of the Cross of Gold. He gave thousands of speeches and came across as kind of shrill and out of control, which is not what you want during a depression. But what really cost the Democrats the election and what gave William McKinley, the Republican, the victory was gold discoveries in the Yukon Klondike region of Canada and Alaska. Billions of dollars of gold were discovered in 1896, and those billions of dollars poured back into the economy and stopped the Great Depression and restored confidence in gold again. So, absent the Klondike discoveries, I'm not sure what would have happened, but because of the Yukon Klondike, William McKinley, the Republican, got the election, won the office. Now, in the aftermath of the election of 1896, the Populist Party kind of faded away, and so did the whole farmers' movement, which is interesting. So, what was the legacy of this movement? I mean, what did it do? Well, it managed to embed into the country the notion that people matter. Because remember, farmers published in newspapers. Their speakers were very active. It wasn't just farmers who heard the message of the farmers' movement. We know that the farmers were strong enough that they managed to infect William Jennings Bryan, who then brought farmer attitudes into the Democratic Party, transforming it into the Party of Welfare. But it wasn't just the Democratic Party that was affected. You see, another group of people was deeply troubled by the Depression of 1893 and picked up the farmers' ideas in the aftermath of that depression, and that was the middle class. Now, the middle class had never really, in the Gilded Age, cared much about the poor or about the poor farmers or anything. But in the Depression of 1893, it was the middle class who suddenly entered poverty. It's one thing to talk about the poor when they were those people over there. It's very different to talk about the poor when it's you, when your business is failing and your bank is suspending and you're out of money and you don't have any options. Suddenly, the poor was you. It was the middle class. So when the middle class confronted this problem, all of a sudden they wanted the poor to matter. So they picked up the populist idea of helping people, of improving the country, of bringing up the poor. And when they did, our country would enter into a whole new era known as the Progressive Era, which took place from the late 1890s to right about 1918. In the Progressive Era, we see the middle class trying to change the United States to make it more humane. What the middle class were doing was applying the conscience that was first laid out by the farmers' movement. So its legacy continued on. That's why the farmers' movement went away. We simply didn't need it anymore. It was embedded into the country.